My name is Emily Carter. I am 34 years old, and last Halloween was the night I finally understood how invisible I had become in my own family. While my younger sister Kimberly was handed the keys to a brand new delivery van and a lease for her dream costume shop, I was given a plastic pumpkin bucket from the discount aisle. Price tag still stuck on the bottom, a mocking $1.99. I remember holding it in my lap, the orange plastic grinning up at me like a cruel joke, while my parents applauded Kim as though she had just saved the world. That moment cracked something open inside me. 34 years of favoritism condensed into one absurd gift. And I know what you might be wondering. Why would a family make such choices? Why does one daughter get everything, while the other is expected to survive on scraps of recognition? That's the question that haunted me as I walked out of their house at 2 in the morning, suitcase in hand, determined never to play the silent role again. This is not just a Halloween story. It's about betrayal, boundaries, and how a single night can change the architecture of a life. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll see how I turned a cheap bucket into a symbol of freedom. And if you've ever felt overlooked or replaced, you might recognize yourself here. While you're listening, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. More stories like mine deserve to be heard. When I tell you that night wasn't the first time I'd been overlooked, I mean, it was only the final straw. The truth stretches all the way back to birthdays and graduations, the kind of moments that are supposed to shape who we become. I was 8 when Kimberly turned 5. She had a backyard carnival, clowns, cotton candy, even a rented pony. The neighbors talked about it for weeks. My birthday, just 1 year later, was a grocery store cake in the kitchen with 2 classmates who barely knew my name. My parents' explanation? You're more independent, Emily. Kim needs the attention. Back then, I swallowed it like medicine. Bitter, but unquestioned. By high school, the pattern had become scripture in our house. When I won valedictorian, I looked out at the sea of faces. But the family section was empty. My parents were at Kimberly's soccer tournament 3 towns over. They promised to watch the recording, but the tape gathered dust on my dresser until I left for college. College only sharpened the divide. I juggled scholarships and 2 part-time jobs, stretching every dollar. Meanwhile, Kimberly backpacked across Europe, posting photos from Paris and Rome, trips paid for in full. When I asked why, Dad said, "Kim needs to find herself." You already know who you are. That line stuck with me, etched into my ribs. Independence wasn't freedom. It was abandonment dressed up as praise. And the cruelest part? I believed them. For years, I thought being overlooked meant I was strong. But on Halloween night, with that $1.99 pumpkin in my lap, I finally saw it for what it was. Not strength, not independence, just neglect. That Halloween night, sitting there with orange plastic glowing in my lap, I had rehearsed something far different. For the entire 7-hour drive down from Seattle, I practiced the words aloud. Senior structural engineer, a promotion I had bled for, trading weekends and sleep for blueprints and deadlines. I imagined their faces, finally proud, finally seeing me not as Kimberly's responsible sister, but as Emily, the woman who built towers that would outlast us all. I waited for my moment, but it never came. Dad was too busy outside circling Kim's delivery van like it was a trophy. Mom snapped photos for Facebook, captioning them with lines about our star. And Kim, she leaned close, perfume clouding the air, patting my knee like I was a child. "Don't worry, sis," she smirked. "If your old Corolla breaks down, I'll give you a ride in the van." My clients expect a certain image, you know. Her words stung sharper than the October air. Because my Corolla, the one I'd bought, paid off, and maintained on my own, had carried me through mountain passes and job sites without complaint. Unlike the BMW in our driveway with its ridiculous red bow, my car earned its place. I opened my mouth ready to tell them, ready to demand recognition. But the room hummed with laughter and clinking glasses that did not include me. My news sat heavy in my chest, unsaid, suffocating. And in that silence, I finally saw the pattern crystallize. 34 years of being responsible wasn't the badge of honor they pretended it was. It was the excuse they used to forget me. At 2 in the morning, the laughter downstairs still hadn't died. Kimberly's voice carried through the vents, animated, full of dreams about how she'd decorate the storefront, how she'd finally be taken seriously. Every word was a nail hammered into the coffin of the little hope I had left that night. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the one with the faded quilt and creaking frame, and stared at the suitcase I'd thrown open hours earlier. My grandmother's old teddy bear, the college photo album, the blueprint of my first real project. They went in first. Not much else followed. The expensive bracelet I'd bought for Mom, the leather briefcase for Dad, the camera lens for Kim, all still wrapped beneath the tree. Let them keep those symbols. They were never about gratitude anyway. Downstairs, the house hummed with the sound of belonging, a sound that somehow never included me. My hands didn't tremble as I zipped the suitcase. For once, they were steady, purposeful. In the kitchen, I laid my house key on the counter next to the coffee pot. The metal clink echoed louder than it should have, like a gavel striking wood. A verdict. By 3 a.m., I was on the road. Streetlights smeared into watery halos on the windshield, snowflakes sticking like tiny verdicts of their own. My Corolla's heater coughed against the December cold, but it kept going, faithful like it always had been. And here's the twist. As my phone buzzed with a new message, I glanced down, hoping, just hoping. It was someone asking if I was safe. But it wasn't. It was my mother. Don't forget to help your sister hang the Halloween lights tomorrow. That was the moment I knew. If I stayed, I'd disappear forever. The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of wet asphalt cutting through the dark Oregon night. My Corolla's wipers squeaked in rhythm, fighting the heavy slush that sprayed from passing trucks. For a few seconds at a time, I drove blind. Headlights blurred into golden streaks. And in that blindness, the memories came. I saw my 5th birthday, Kim's carnival of balloons, clowns, and ponies. Then my 6th, 2 friends, a dollar store banner, and Dad's excuse, "You don't need the fuss, Emily." "You're strong." I remembered high school graduation, scanning the bleachers, searching for their faces. The seat was empty. They'd gone to Kim's away soccer game instead. Mom's voice echoed, "We'll watch the recording." "You always do fine without us. College was worse." I shelved books at midnight and swiped meal cards just to survive. Meanwhile, postcards arrived from Paris, Rome, and Barcelona, Kim finding herself on their dime. When I asked why, Dad's voice on the phone was flat. "Kim needs the experience. You already know who you are." That line rattled around my chest as the snow thickened. You already know who you are. At the time, I wore it like armor. But tonight, on that highway, I finally saw it for what it was. Not armor, shackles. It was a system, perfectly balanced. Dad controlled the money, bankrolling Kim while withholding from me. Mom controlled the emotions, smothering Kim with care while shaming me with guilt. Together, they wrote a script where my role was always the same: the capable one, the independent one, the invisible one. And the cruelest part? I believed them. I built my life on the illusion that being overlooked meant I was strong. The heater wheezed, filling the cabin with lukewarm air. My breath fogged the windshield as I whispered the words out loud, as if saying them could break the spell. It wasn't strength. It was neglect. The Corolla rattled over a pothole, jolting me upright. The truth landed heavier than the snow on my hood. Every medal, every late-night shift, every sacrifice had been twisted into proof that I didn't need love. That was the inheritance I'd been given. Not money, not care, but a hollow independence dressed up as praise. The miles blurred, Oregon melting into Washington, snow flurries chasing the glow of my headlights. My phone buzzed on the console, Dad's name flashing again. I let it ring until it died, the silence in its place louder than his shouting ever was. But then, another name lit the screen, Monica Perez, my college roommate, the one who had seen enough to know the truth. I pressed call before I could talk myself out of it. Emily! It's 2 in the morning. Her voice was groggy but steady, like a rope thrown across a chasm. I'm driving south, I said, my throat tightening. I don't know where. I just couldn't stay. There was a pause, the kind that used to terrify me in my parents' house, always followed by guilt or accusation. But Monica's pause was different. She was listening. Come here, she said finally. Vancouver's not far off the highway. Guest room's empty. I'll make coffee. I can't impose, I whispered, the old reflex clawing up my throat. Stop. Her tone sharpened, but with care. You've spent your whole life being the helper. Let someone help you for once. Her words cracked something open inside me. Help. Such a simple word. But in my family, it had always meant sacrifice, debt, obligation. This was different. No strings, no ledger, no performance required. Okay, I whispered, surprised at myself. Okay. As I hung up, the road signs shifted. Portland, then Vancouver ahead. For the first time that night, my shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch. Maybe this was what safety felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who actually meant it when they said, I've got you. Monica's guest room was small, just a futon, a desk, and curtains thin enough for the morning light to slice through. But to me, it felt like a cathedral. For the first time in years, I slept without waking to footsteps in the hallway, without bracing for someone else's needs to outweigh mine. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. It was a coworker from Seattle who texted first. Emily, are you okay? Just saw your mom's post. My stomach tightened as I opened Facebook. There it was, a carefully staged photo of Kimberly's kids squeezed together on a couch, faces painted with exaggerated frowns. The caption read, "Some daughters put family first. Others walk out without a thought, leaving innocent children without a safe home." Prayers appreciated hundreds of likes, dozens of comments. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years promising to pray for my mother's strength. Old family friends writing lines like, Emily always was the difficult one. I stared at the screen, hands numb. It wasn't enough for them to neglect me. Now they had rewritten the story entirely. In their version, I wasn't the daughter who left to save herself. I was the villain who abandoned everyone else. Monica appeared in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. She saw my face and didn't even need to ask. They've started the campaign, she said flatly, setting a mug in front of me. That's when it hit me. Leaving the house was only the beginning. My parents weren't going to let me go quietly. They needed me in the role they'd written. Selfish, ungrateful, cruel. Because without that scapegoat, the whole script of our family would collapse. And this time, they'd chosen Facebook as their stage. The call started before noon. Aunt Carol's voice first, sharp, dripping with disappointment. Emily, how could you? Your poor mother's blood pressure is sky high because of you. I hung up before she could finish. Then came Uncle Rick, then Cousin Jenna, then even Pastor Williams from our childhood church, each reciting the same script about selfishness, duty, and family first. My phone vibrated so constantly, it felt like a live wire in my hand. I wanted to throw it against the wall, but curiosity pinned me in place. How did they all know where to find me? That answer arrived with the next ding. A message from an old neighbor, cheerful and oblivious. So glad your mom shared Monica's address. Hope you're getting the support you need there. My chest tightened, heat rising up my neck. Monica's guest room, my fragile bubble of safety, was no longer mine. My own mother had posted it online, gift-wrapped for anyone who wanted to shame, guilt, or harass me. By evening, a box of cookies arrived on Monica's porch with a note taped on top. For Kimberly's kids, since their aunt can't be bothered. The sugar smell was sickly sweet, but all I tasted was bile. Monica's jaw clenched when she saw it. This isn't just family drama anymore, Em. This is harassment. She was right. My parents weren't just pulling strings in private. They were turning my life into a public trial. And the verdict had already been written. Guilty of walking away. I sat on the futon that night, curtains drawn, wondering if leaving Portland had really freed me at all, or if I'd simply carried their chains into a different room. The night after the cookies, I sat at Monica's desk with a yellow legal pad, scribbling down everything I could remember. Calls, texts, Facebook posts, even the box on the porch. Document, don't argue, Monica kept reminding me. Facts have weight. Emotions they'll twist. So I began building my own paper trail. Step 1, change every password I'd ever used. Bank accounts, email, even my Netflix login. Step 2, forward my mail directly to the office. Step 3, block every number tied to my parents' house. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. But when I called the bank to set up two-factor authentication, the floor shifted beneath me. Miss Carter, the rep said cheerfully, we already updated your mailing address to the one your parents provided. My breath caught. Excuse me? What address? He rattled it off. The Portland house I'd just fled. My parents had called, claimed they were consolidating my paperwork for safekeeping. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. That's fraud. They had no authorization. The rep hesitated. Suddenly, cautious. They sounded convincing. A family matter, I assumed family matter. The words curdled in my stomach. Once again, the story had worked. My independence erased by the narrative of she always lets them handle things. When I hung up, the room tilted. The guest room that had felt like a cathedral now pressed in like a cell. They weren't just rewriting me on Facebook. They were reaching into my finances, my future, the very bones of my stability. Monica found me pacing, fists clenched. They're not just after my reputation, I told her. They're after my life. And here's the twist. I realized escape wasn't enough. If I didn't fight back, they would keep building their case until even I started believing it again. So I opened the legal pad to a fresh page, and at the top, in capital letters, I wrote, evidence. This wouldn't just be survival anymore. It would be a record, proof of the truth they had spent 34 years burying. The next morning, my desk looked less like a guest room and more like a war room. Printouts of text messages, screenshots of Facebook posts, even the bank's call log. I stacked them into neat piles, labeling each one in black marker. Every page felt like a brick in the wall I was finally building between me and them. That's when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Emily Carter? The voice was warm, confident. This is David Kim. We went to college together. Constitutional law seminar? It took me a second. Then I remembered. The sharp-eyed guy who used to argue with professors and somehow always won. I saw your mom's post, he continued, almost apologetically. And I know you probably don't want more people in your business, but this is textbook harassment. You don't have to fight it alone. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Help, real help, still felt like a foreign language. David broke the silence. I can draft a cease and desist. Free of charge. They'll know you're serious. Sometimes the only language people like that understand is legal. I stared at the piles of paper around me, my fortress of proof. Suddenly, it didn't look pathetic. It looked like ammunition. David, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I think I might actually need that. And for the first time in weeks, maybe years, the tightness in my chest eased just enough to let a sliver of hope in. David came by that Sunday, briefcase in one hand, thermos of coffee in the other. We sat at Monica's kitchen table, my fortress of papers spread between us. This is solid, he said, tapping the bank statement logs. Textbook case of harassment and overreach. A cease and desist letter is the first shot across the bow. For the first time, I let myself imagine it. My parents actually being forced to stop. The fantasy was almost intoxicating. But that evening, the phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't just a call. It was a group text. Every cousin, aunt, and uncle lit up my screen with the same message. 7 p.m. Tuesday at Grandma's house. Family meeting. Mandatory. Like I was 12 again. Against my better judgment, I went. Some stubborn part of me still wanted to believe reason was possible. When I walked into Grandma's living room, the air was thick with the smell of pot roast and accusation. My parents sat on the couch like royalty. Kimberly perched beside them, her expression carefully wounded. The rest of the family formed a semicircle, faces solemn, waiting for the performance to begin. Dad stood first, voice booming like a judge delivering a sentence. Emily has lost her way. She's turned her back on family. We are here to remind her of her duty. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the room. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that was still dry. She doesn't mean harm, she said softly, but she's been influenced by outsiders. Her gaze flicked toward me, then toward Monica, who had insisted on driving me here. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Kimberly beat me to it. She called the police on us, she said, her voice trembling. On her own family. How can anyone do that? Gasps filled the room. I stood there, heart pounding, realizing this wasn't a conversation. It was a trial, and the verdict had already been written. But here's the twist. Instead of collapsing under the weight of it, I heard David's voice in my head from earlier that day. Facts have weight. Emotions, they'll twist. So I pulled out my folder, laid it on Grandma's coffee table, and said, "Then let's look at the facts." The room fell silent, every eye on me. For once, I wasn't the defendant. I was the one holding the evidence. I slid the folder across Grandma's coffee table, its weight landing like a hammer. "These aren't opinions," I said, my voice steady. "These are records." First, I showed the bank log where my mailing address had been changed without permission. Then the screenshots of Mom's Facebook post, painting me as a villain, while Kimberly's kids posed like stage props. Finally, the call log from the bank. Time-stamped proof my parents had pretended to be me. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the old floor heater. Dad's jaw clenched. "Anyone can forge documents," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Mom reached for the tissue again, her eyes darting to the cousins as though sheer performance could hold their loyalty. "We only wanted to protect her," she whispered. "She's so fragile she doesn't even know it." That's when it happened. The crack in the circle. Uncle Ray, who had been quiet in his chair by the window, leaned forward. "Protect her?" His voice was low, but it carried. "I remember Emily working double shifts in college while Kimberly spent a year in Europe on your dime. You called that protection too?" All heads turned. Mom's face drained of color. "I thought it was just favoritism," Uncle Ray continued. "But this," he tapped the papers with one calloused finger, "this is manipulation and fraud." A murmur rippled across the room. Cousin Jenna shifted uncomfortably, her eyes no longer fixed on me but on my parents. For the first time, the script they'd rehearsed wasn't landing. And in that moment, I realized something important. They needed the family's approval to keep control. And that approval was slipping. The living room no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a dam cracking under pressure. Uncle Ray's words lingered in the stale air, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. "How could you favor one child so openly?" Cousin Jenna demanded, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "We thought Emily was exaggerating," Aunt Carol muttered, eyes darting between me and my parents. "But these papers—" Mom pressed the tissue to her lips, trembling. but Dad's mask slipped. His face flushed, his jaw grinding like gear stripped bare. "Enough," he barked. "This isn't a family meeting, it's a witch hunt." But the tide had shifted. "Then answer this," Uncle Ray said, leaning forward. "Why were you calling the bank in Emily's name? What were you trying to access?" Dad froze, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I felt my pulse pound in my ears. "What accounts, Dad?" My voice was low, dangerous. Because the rep mentioned more than my checking account. He said, "Consolidating records?" What does that mean? The room fell silent again. I could hear the old clock ticking, each second like a drumbeat. Mom finally broke, her voice quivering. It was just paperwork. To make things easier. Easier for who? I shot back. And then the truth slipped out. Not from them, but from Grandma, who had been silent until now. Her voice was brittle but clear. "They've been taking loans, haven't they?" "Using your credit?" My stomach dropped. The ripple of shock moved through the family like a wave. Dad's head snapped toward Grandma. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Grandma's cloudy eyes locked on him with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "I heard you on the phone last spring, talking about cosigner approvals. I thought you meant Kimberly. But now..." My hands went cold as the realization hit me. They hadn't just rewritten me as the selfish daughter. They had tethered me financially, quietly, invisibly, using my stability as their safety net. The betrayal was bone deep. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This was theft. "Show us the paperwork," Uncle Ray demanded. "Right now." Dad's fists clenched at his sides. Mom's lips trembled. Kimberly looked away, her face pale. The family script had unraveled completely. And for the first time in my life, my parents looked cornered. I pressed my palms flat against Grandma's coffee table, leaning into the silence that had swallowed the room. "If there are loans in my name," I said, each word deliberate, "I will find them. And if you've tied me to your debts, you've crossed a line you can't come back from." Dad's nostrils flared, his jaw locked. Mom shifted uneasily, trying to summon tears that never quite came. But it was Kimberly's reaction that caught me. Her eyes flickering toward Mom just for a second, like a child checking whether she was allowed to speak. And then she slipped. "It was supposed to be temporary," she blurted, "just until we closed on the new place." The room froze. "What new place?" I demanded. Kimberly's face drained of color. "Nothing," she stammered. But the damage was done. Uncle Ray narrowed his eyes. "They're using Emily's credit to buy you a house, aren't they?" The words landed like a thunderclap. My pulse hammered in my ears. For a moment, I saw it clearly. The blueprint of their plan. My steady job, my spotless credit, all leveraged to buy Kimberly the dream home while I carried the liability. Mom reached for Kimberly's hand, voice trembling with false softness. "It's family, Emily." "Just paperwork. You wouldn't have even noticed." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "You mean I wouldn't have noticed until the bank came for me when you missed payments?" The mask slipped from their faces at last. Mom's lips pressed tight, Dad's fist trembling at his sides, Kimberly's eyes wet with a shame she couldn't quite hide. And in that crack of truth, I understood. They weren't just willing to sacrifice me. They had already started. 2 days after the family meeting, I sat in David's car outside the downtown bank, my stomach in knots. The glass building loomed above us like some cathedral of numbers and secrets. "You don't have to do this today," David said, his voice calm. But I shook my head. "No, if they've tied me to something, I need to see it with my own eyes." Inside, the banker greeted us with polite smiles until David slid his business card across the desk. "We need to review all accounts and applications under the name Emily Carter," he said, his tone all steel. The man hesitated, then typed quickly on his keyboard. Pages appeared on his screen, his eyes flicking between us and the monitor. Checking, savings, all active and clean, he murmured. Then his face shifted. But there is a pending application. My pulse spiked. Pending for what? He swallowed. A mortgage pre-approval for a property in Ridgewood Estates. 5 bedrooms, 3 baths. His voice trailed off as he clicked. It's in your name, Miss Carter. Employment verified. Credit history attached. Just awaiting signature. The room tilted. Ridgewood Estates. I remembered the listings Dad had casually mentioned during the ambush. Dinner, perfect playroom, good backyard for the kids. I gripped the edge of the chair. I never applied for this. David leaned forward, voice sharp. Then someone forged her identity. Print everything. Now the banker's hands trembled as he complied, sliding a stack of documents toward us. My own name stared back from every page. Address, income, even my signature. Shaky, but frighteningly close to mine. It felt like staring into a mirror I hadn't touched. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tear the papers in half. But instead, I whispered the only truth that mattered. They were ready to chain me to a house I'd never live in. David placed a steady hand on the folder. This isn't just harassment anymore, Emily. This is fraud. And now, we have proof. For the first time, I wasn't just the scapegoat in their family story. I was the plaintiff, with evidence. And they had no idea. The script was about to flip. That night, I walked back into my parents' house, the folder of documents tucked under my arm like a loaded weapon. The smell of pot roast still clung to the walls, as if the house itself hadn't realized the family inside was crumbling. I dropped the papers on the kitchen table. Ridgewood Estates, I said. My voice was flat, almost foreign to my own ears. Whose idea was it to forge my name? Dad didn't roar like I expected. He sagged into a chair, shoulders hunched, eyes bloodshot. Mom's tissue crumpled in her fist, but no tears came this time. We didn't have a choice, Dad muttered. His voice was gravel, ground down by years of denial. The debts, the medical bills, the credit cards were drowning. Emily. Mom leaned forward, her voice sharp with desperation. It was just to get approved. Once the house sold, we'd catch up, pay it off. Kimberly and the kids needed stability. We all did. The words hung between us like smoke, acrid and suffocating. For 34 years, every plea had been wrapped in the language of family. But now the mask slipped. This wasn't about love. It was survival. And they were willing to survive by sinking me with them. I looked at them, their hollow eyes, the lines carved by years of spending what they didn't have. And for a flicker of a second, pity stabbed through my anger. But pity is not trust. You didn't just ask me for help, I said softly. You tried to erase me. Mom reached across the table, fingers trembling. Emily, please. Don't let us lose everything, and here's the twist. For the first time, they weren't commanding me. They were begging. The silence stretched so long I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock above the stove. My parents sat slumped, not as accusers, but as supplicants. Their pride cracked like porcelain. For a flicker of a second, I wondered if this was the moment I was meant to cave, to be the dutiful daughter who saves the family name. But then Kimberly appeared in the doorway. Her makeup was perfect, as always, but her voice betrayed her. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Emily. You know the Ridgewood house was the only option. The words landed with a weight my parents' pleas hadn't. Because there, in the slip of her tone, I heard it. Not desperation, but ownership. I turned to her slowly. The only option? For who? She crossed her arms, eyes flashing. For all of us. For Mom and Dad, for the kids. That house would have given them rooms of their own. A backyard? A real chance. You have no idea how hard it's been. Dad shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't contradict her. Mom's gaze flickered to the crumpled tissue in her hand, and then it hit me. The forged signature, the listings annotated with perfect playroom and guest room for Aunt Carol, the urgency to rush the application through. It hadn't been their plan alone. Kimberly had pulled the strings. "You pushed this," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You told them I'd never notice. That my name, my credit, my future could just be collateral for your comfort." Kimberly's jaw tightened. "Don't twist this." I did it for the kids. They deserve better than being crammed into that tiny rental." My laugh was hollow, echoing in the kitchen. "And you decided they deserved it more than I deserved my own life." The room went still. My parents looked small, diminished, like puppets whose strings had been yanked one time too many. And here was the twist. For decades, I'd believed they were the ones scripting my role in this family drama. But in truth, Kimberly had been the playwright all along, and they, terrified of losing her approval, had played their parts. I pushed the folder of forged documents toward her. "These aren't just mistakes, Kim. They're crimes. And you didn't just gamble with my credit, you gambled with my existence." Her face faltered, just for a heartbeat, before snapping back into practiced defiance. "So what are you going to do? Turn in your own family?" The question hung in the air like a trap. But this time I wasn't the one caught. The next morning, David spread the forged mortgage papers across his office desk like a battlefield map. His pen hovered over a legal pad as he explained the process. Fraud complaint, potential criminal charges, injunction to block any further attempts. Each word was a lifeline, tugging me closer to safety. "This is winnable, Emily," he said, his eyes steady. "But you have to be ready for the fallout. Once we file, it's war." For the first time in weeks, I nodded without hesitation. "Then let's start the war." I left his office feeling almost lighter, the weight of decision finally lifting from my chest. But the moment I stepped into the parking lot, I spotted a familiar figure leaning against a beat-up pickup truck. It was Cousin Jenna. She looked nervous, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "Emily," she hissed, glancing over her shoulder. "You need to know something before it's too late." My stomach tightened. "What now?" She pulled out her phone, showing me a group chat screenshot. Dozens of family members, my name plastered in every message. Mom had written, "She's being manipulated by outsiders. If we all speak with one voice, we can prove she's unstable. The court will never side with her." I stared at the screen, the words burning. Unstable, manipulated. Exactly the story they'd used to keep me quiet since childhood. Jenna's voice broke through my thoughts. "They're going to make you look like the villain." Again. Only this time they'll do it in front of a judge. The parking lot felt suddenly smaller, the air tighter. The war had already begun, and they weren't planning to fight fair. David's office smelled of burnt coffee and printer ink, the perfume of every late-night legal battle. He slid Jenna's screenshots across the desk with a care usually reserved for glass. "This," he said, tapping the phone screen, "is gold." I leaned forward. The words stared back at me. "We'll say she's unstable. She's easily influenced. We'll make it about her mental health." The old fear clawed at my chest. The fear that no matter what evidence I had, no matter how hard I worked, they would always twist the story until I was the villain. But David's voice cut through. "Emily, this isn't just gossip. This is premeditated character assassination. A coordinated plan. Judges hate this." For the first time, I saw it differently. Not as proof of my weakness, but of their corruption. David's pen scratched across the legal pad. "We'll file for fraud and add a motion for defamation. And when we present these texts, we won't just show what they did. We'll show who they are." I imagined the courtroom, Dad shifting in his chair, Mom dabbing at phantom tears, Kimberly avoiding my gaze, and behind them, the glowing screen of evidence that couldn't be spun away. Still, the weight pressed on me. "They'll say I'm destroying the family," I murmured. David looked me dead in the eye. "Families destroy themselves when they choose lies over love. You're just pulling off the mask." The printer hummed, spitting out copies of the forged mortgage documents, the bank call logs, and now Jenna's screenshots. A paper arsenal. Each page felt like a brick in a wall I'd never had before, a barrier between their control and my life. By the time we finished organizing, the stack stood inches tall. David slipped the top sheet into a folder embossed with his firm's name. "Tomorrow, we file." After that, the narrative changes. They don't get to paint you as unstable anymore. They get painted as fraudsters. Walking out into the night air, I felt the shift. For 34 years, I'd been the scapegoat, the dutiful daughter, the silent one who swallowed pain so the family machine could keep running. But tomorrow, in black and white ink, I would be something else entirely. The one who finally held them accountable. And the irony wasn't lost on me. The very words they'd written to bury me would become the shovel that dug their own grave. The courthouse air was stale, full of whispers and echoes of footsteps. But when the judge's gavel came down, the weight shifted. Fraud confirmed. The forged mortgage dissolved before it could ever chain me. And their group chat, their conspiracy, exposed in daylight for everyone to see. The details will fade with time. The paperwork, the depositions, the silence of my parents as the judgment was read. What lingers is the image of Kimberly's face when the truth became undeniable. Not angry, not even ashamed, but hollow, like someone who realized the script she had written no longer worked. Weeks later, my life looks different. I share dinners with friends who ask how my day was without using it as leverage. I've started hosting Sunday brunches in my apartment. Warm light, mismatched mugs, laughter that isn't rehearsed. The word family has begun to mean something else. Not obligation, not manipulation, but choice. Sometimes, late at night, I scroll past old photos. Christmas mornings, birthdays, snapshots of a smiling girl always standing a step to the side. I wonder if forgiveness is possible. Not now, not soon, but maybe one day. I tell myself this: forgiveness doesn't mean letting them back in to hurt me again. It means releasing their grip on my story. And maybe that's the bravest act of all. So here I stand, not with answers, but with a question. If you were me, would you ever open the door again? Or is closing it the only way forward?